From Software's Soulsborne games are known for their challenging gameplay, deep lore, and intricate boss fights. However, not every boss encounter is a highlight. Some battles stand out as poorly designed, frustrating, or underwhelming. This video will examine the worst boss from each Soulsborne game, considering factors such as mechanics, pacing, and overall engagement. Demon's Souls is no stranger to punishing mechanics, but False King Allant takes it to a whole new level of cruelty. Most bosses in the game are content with crushing players into dust, but this smug dickhead goes a step further. He steals hard-earned experience with his soul drain ability. Losing progress in a tough fight is expected, but permanently losing a character level is just sadistic. It's like grinding for hours to afford a nice meal, only to have someone snatch the plate right as you take the first bite. The fight itself is a brutal endurance test. Allant moves with terrifying speed, chaining together devastating attacks that leave little room for mistakes. Blocking is barely an option. Dodging requires near-perfect timing, and healing is an invitation to get slapped across the arena. Just when victory seems possible, he pulls out Soul Drain and rips away a level, punishing players not just in the moment, but for the rest of their playthrough. It's the gaming equivalent of getting kicked while already on the ground. For a final boss, he certainly makes an impression, just not necessarily a good one. While other Soulsborne games challenge players with overwhelming odds, Allant adds an extra layer of frustration that feels like a personal insult. Winning the fight should feel rewarding, but instead, it's more of a sigh of relief after dealing with a mechanic that sucks the fun right out of the battle. A tough final challenge is one thing, but this is just a giant middle finger to the player. Bed of Chaos is less of a boss fight and more of a poorly designed obstacle course that exists purely to waste time. Most Dark Souls bosses demand skill, strategy, and precision, but this flaming mess just asks players to deal with collapsing floors and janky platforming. Breaking the two weak points feels more like a chore than a triumph, and once the floor starts giving out, it turns into a game of guess where you'll fall to your death next. For a game built on tight combat mechanics, this fight feels like an afterthought. The real challenge isn't the boss itself, but the awkward jumping section that follows. Dark Souls was never meant to be a platformer, and the Bed of Chaos makes that painfully clear. Players who make the jump are rewarded with a final sprint toward a tiny, helpless bug that dies in one hit, making the whole encounter feel even more pointless. No well-timed parries, no intricate dodging, just a mad dash through chaos and a cheap death waiting at every misstep. It stands out in the worst possible way compared to the rest of the game's bosses. Every attempt is less about learning patterns and more about hoping the floor doesn't disappear underfoot at the wrong moment. Victory feels more like luck than skill, and by the end, frustration outweighs any sense of accomplishment. Bed of Chaos isn't just a bad boss, it's a flaming pile of fuck you wrapped in a pit of instant death. Royal Rat Authority feels less like a boss fight and more like a poorly planned ambush at a pet store. The moment players step into the arena, they are swarmed by a gang of overenthusiastic rodents that inflict toxic faster than a bad Twitter argument. Taking them out quickly is the only real strategy, because if even one survives long enough to land a hit, the fight turns into a slow, miserable health drain, while the main boss looms in the background like an overgrown house pet waiting for its turn to cause problems. Once the smaller rats are gone, the real disappointment begins. The Royal Rat Authority is essentially a budget version of Sif, except instead of a noble, majestic wolf with fluid animations, it's an awkwardly programmed rat that moves like it's constantly tripping over its own feet. Its hitboxes make little sense, its attacks feel clumsy, and the entire encounter boils down to avoiding a few wide sweeps before chipping away at its health. For a game known for its incredible boss fights, this one feels more like an accident that somehow made it into the final version. Celestial Emissary feels less like a boss fight and more like an unfortunate misunderstanding at an alien family reunion. Instead of facing a monstrous, bloodthirsty horror, players walk into a room filled with squishy blue dudes who look like they just wandered out of a science experiment gone wrong. Swing a weapon a few times, and they pop like overripe fruit, barely putting up a fight. Then, out of nowhere, one of them remembers it's supposed to be a boss and suddenly grows 10 feet taller, as if that's going to make things any more intimidating. The problem is, size doesn't make up for a complete lack of threat. The giant version of the Emissary mostly stands around, waving its arms like it's trying to direct traffic while players hack away at its legs. Occasionally, it jumps into the air for what seems like a big attack, only to land with all the impact of a slightly aggressive pillow fight. The fight is so easy that it barely even qualifies as a warm-up for the horrors that come later in the game, making its placement feel like a weird joke developers forgot to remove. For a game filled with some of the most memorable bosses in From Software's history, Celestial Emissary sticks out in the worst way possible. It has no real challenge, no real lore weight, and no real reason to exist other than to take up space. Even the background music feels like it's trying too hard to make the fight seem more important than it is, like adding dramatic sound effects to someone losing a game of rock, paper, scissors. Bloodborne doesn't have many bad bosses, but this one is just a big, blue waste of time. High Lord Wolnir is proof that size alone doesn't make a boss fight interesting. The moment he drags himself out of the abyss, it looks like something terrifying is about to happen, but then the actual fight begins, and all that intimidation disappears. Instead of a brutal battle, players are left smacking a giant skeleton's jewelry like they're trying to rob an ancient pharaoh. His attacks are slow, his movements are clumsy, and the whole thing feels less like a fight and more like breaking into a cursed tomb with a sledgehammer. The real problem is the mist. Wolnir barely puts up a fight, but if players get too close for too long, he spews out a death cloud that just kills them instantly. It's the kind of next level bullshit that turns an already underwhelming fight into a tedious waiting game. Either players rush in and risk getting deleted by the fog, or they hang back and take potshots at his bracelets, hoping he doesn't decide to crawl forward and end the fight with one bad camera angle. For a game filled with incredible, skill-testing bosses, this fight stands out in all the wrong ways. Breaking glowing weak spots feels more like a gimmick than an actual challenge, and the missed attack exists purely to punish players for trying to engage with the fight properly. High Lord Wolnir could have been a terrifying, high-stakes encounter, but instead, it's just a big skeleton with some fancy bracelets and a fog machine that can go fuck itself. Folding screen monkeys feels less like a boss fight and more like an elaborate game of hide and seek that nobody asked for. Instead of facing a terrifying warrior or a monstrous beast, players are stuck chasing a bunch of trickster monkeys around a maze, trying to figure out which one to smack first. Each monkey has its own gimmick, but none of them put up a real fight, making the whole encounter feel more like a weird side quest that somehow got promoted to boss status. In a game built around tight, skill-based combat, this slow, puzzle-like distraction sticks out like a sore thumb. The biggest problem is how completely it derails the game's pacing. After cutting through intense duels and brutal enemies, suddenly being forced into a stealth-based scavenger hunt feels like slamming on the brakes during a high-speed chase. The concept is interesting on paper, but in execution, it just feels like padding between real challenges. Instead of a heart-pounding test of skill, it becomes a drawn-out sequence of trial and error, making it one of the least exciting boss fights in a game that otherwise thrives on fast, brutal combat. The Godskin duel is the kind of fight that makes players wonder if From Software just ran out of ideas. Instead of creating a fresh, engaging challenge, they slapped two already annoying enemies into a cramped arena and called it a day. The result is a chaotic mess where dodging feels pointless. Attacks come from every angle, and victory depends more on endurance than actual skill. The worst part is that they can revive each other, dragging the fight out far longer than it needs to be, turning what should be an intense battle into a tedious grind. There's no real satisfaction in winning this fight, only relief that it's finally over. Most bosses in Elden Ring reward mastery and patience, but the Godskin duel just punishes players for existing. The fight demands near-perfect execution, but not in a way that feels fair or fun. The arena is too small, the enemies are too aggressive, and the whole encounter feels more like a co-op nightmare that somehow made it into a single-player game. It's the kind of design choice that makes people take a break just to mentally recover from the nonsense they just endured. For a game filled with some of the most incredible boss fights from Software's history, this one stands out for all the wrong reasons. It's not just hard, it's the wrong kind of hard. The kind that feels like a chore rather than a challenge. The duel could have been an epic showdown, but instead, it's just a frustrating, recycled pile of shit that overstays its welcome. Each Soulsborne game contains both exceptional and flawed boss encounters. While these fights may not be the highlights of their respective games, they serve as examples of where boss design can falter. Do you agree with this list? Are there any other bosses that stand out as particularly frustrating or underwhelming? Share your thoughts in the comments and be sure to subscribe for more Soulsborne content.